Sacagawea was a Shoshone woman who became one of the most celebrated figures in American history through her role as interpreter and guide on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Sacagawea, whose name likely means bird woman in Hidatsa, was born around 1788 in the Lemhi River Valley in what is now Idaho. She came from the Agaidica tribe, also known as the Salmon Eater Band of the Lemhi Shoshone. She grew up in the rugged mountain country of the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea's early life was shaped by the traditional ways of her people, learning to gather roots and berries and understanding the land that would later prove invaluable to American explorers. When she was approximately 12 years old, around 1800, Sacagawea's life changed dramatically. A raiding party of Hidatsa warriors attacked her village near the Three Forks of the Missouri River. The raid was violent and destructive. Several Shoshone were killed in the attack, and Sacagawea was among several young women and children taken captive. She was forcibly removed from her homeland, her family, and everything she had known. The Hidatsa took their captives hundreds of miles east to their villages near present-day Washburn, North Dakota. For a young girl torn from her people, this journey must have been terrifying and traumatic. Sacagawea found herself in a completely foreign world, forced to adapt to a new language, new customs, and a new life among her captors. In the Hidatsa villages, Sacagawea's life took another turn when she became one of the wives of Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was a French-Canadian fur trapper who lived among the Hidatsa and Mandan tribes. He was not a young man when he took Sacagawea as his wife. She was approximately 16 years old at the time, while he was in his 40s. Charbonneau had another Shoshone wife as well. He was known as a man of questionable character by many who encountered him, described as somewhat cowardly and not particularly skilled as a frontiersman. However, his knowledge of indigenous languages would soon make him valuable to an ambitious American expedition. Sacagawea was pregnant with her first child when the Corps of Discovery arrived at the Mandan villages in the winter of 1804. The Lewis and Clark expedition had been commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Jefferson wanted to explore the newly acquired territory, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, establish trade with Native American tribes, and assert American sovereignty over the region. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River, and by November 1804 they had reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota. The expedition needed to winter there before continuing westward. During this time, Lewis and Clark realized they would need interpreters and guides, particularly someone who could communicate with the Shoshone people. They knew they would need to obtain horses from the Shoshone to cross the Rocky Mountains, and without those horses, their expedition would likely fail. Toussaint Charbonneau approached the captains and offered his services as an interpreter. He spoke Hidatsa and French, but more importantly, his young Shoshone wife could translate Shoshone to Hidatsa. Through a chain of translation, communication could be established with the Shoshone when the expedition reached the mountains. Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau in November 1804, and Sacagawea became part of the expedition by extension. On February 11, 1805, in the middle of a brutal winter at Fort Mandan, Sacagawea gave birth to her first child, a son she named Jean-Baptiste. The labor was long and difficult. Meriwether Lewis, who had some medical knowledge, gave her a potion made from rattlesnake rattle, which supposedly helped speed the delivery. Whether this remedy actually helped or the timing was coincidental remains unknown, but the baby was born healthy. The expedition members called the infant Pomp or Pompey, and William Clark became particularly attached to the child. When the Corps of Discovery departed Fort Mandan on April 7, 1805, Sacagawea traveled with them, carrying her infant son on her back in a cradleboard. She was the only woman on the expedition, traveling with approximately 33 men including her husband. She was barely 17 years old. The journey up the Missouri River was arduous and dangerous. The expedition traveled in pirogues and canoes, facing strong currents, dangerous rapids, and unpredictable weather. Sacagawea proved her worth almost immediately. She gathered edible plants and roots that supplemented the expedition's diet, providing crucial nutrition that prevented scurvy and other illnesses. She knew which plants were edible and where to find them, knowledge that came from her childhood training as a Shoshone woman. In May 1805, a critical incident demonstrated Sacagawea's composure under pressure. One of the pirogues, carrying many of the expedition's most important supplies including journals, instruments, and medicine, nearly capsized in a sudden squall. Charbonneau, who was steering, panicked and froze. While the men struggled to control the boat, Sacagawea calmly reached into the water and retrieved items that were floating away. Her quick thinking saved irreplaceable materials and documents. Lewis later wrote in his journal praising her fortitude and resolution. This incident elevated her standing among the expedition members, who already appreciated her contributions. As the expedition traveled westward, Sacagawea began to recognize landmarks from her childhood. In July 1805, they reached the Three Forks of the Missouri, where the river splits into three branches. Sacagawea recognized this as the place where she had been captured 5 years earlier. The memories must have been both painful and hopeful, painful for the trauma she had experienced, hopeful because she knew she was getting closer to her people. She helped guide the expedition, pointing out Beaverhead Rock, a distinctive landmark that indicated Shoshone territory was near. Her knowledge of the geography proved invaluable as the expedition navigated increasingly difficult terrain. The expedition desperately needed to find the Shoshone and obtain horses before winter arrived. Without horses, they could not cross the mountains, and without crossing the mountains, they could not reach the Pacific. The stakes were incredibly high. In August 1805, Lewis took a small advance party ahead to search for the Shoshone while Clark continued with the main group and the boats. When Lewis finally encountered a Shoshone band, he managed to convince them to come meet the rest of the expedition. The reunion that followed was extraordinary and emotional. When Sacagawea was brought in to translate, she suddenly recognized the Shoshone chief. It was Kamiwait, her own brother. The reunion was overwhelming. She had not seen her family in 5 years and had assumed she would never see them again. She wept with joy as she embraced her brother. The reunion was bittersweet. Sacagawea learned that most of her family had died. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. She had one brother and a nephew remaining. Despite the emotional turmoil, Sacagawea performed her duty as interpreter. The negotiations for horses were complicated and tense. Kamiwait was initially reluctant to provide horses because his people needed them for their own survival, particularly for their upcoming buffalo hunt. Sacagawea translated back and forth, facilitating communication between her brother and the American captains. She learned that she had been promised in marriage to a Shoshone man before her capture, but that man had since married someone else. Her life had taken a path she never could have imagined. Sacagawea faced a profound choice. She could have stayed with her people, returned to the life she had been torn from 5 years earlier. Her brother would have welcomed her back. But she chose to continue with the expedition. Her reasons for this decision are not entirely clear from the historical record. Perhaps she felt obligated to complete the journey. Perhaps she had adapted to her new life and felt uncertain about returning. Perhaps she wanted to see the Great Water, the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps she simply accepted that her fate was now tied to Charbonneau and her son. Whatever her reasons, she obtained horses for the expedition and continued westward with the core of discovery. The crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains was the most difficult part of the entire expedition. The terrain was treacherous, the weather was cold and snowy even in September, and food was scarce. The expedition nearly starved crossing those mountains. They were forced to eat some of their horses and even candles to survive. Sacagawea continued to carry her infant son through these brutal conditions. The physical demands on her body were extraordinary. She was still nursing Jean-Baptiste while hiking through mountain passes, fording icy streams, and enduring near-starvation conditions. Her resilience and endurance were remarkable. After crossing the mountains, the expedition reached the Columbia River system and began the final leg of their journey to the Pacific. They traveled by canoe down the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia rivers. The river journey was faster but still dangerous, with numerous rapids and waterfalls to navigate. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote in his journal Ocean in View. Oh, the joy! They had reached the Pacific Ocean. The expedition established Fort Clatsop on the south side of the Columbia River near present-day Astoria, Oregon, where they would spend the winter before returning east. During the winter at Fort Clatsop, an incident occurred that revealed Sacagawea's determination and spirit. A whale had washed up on the beach several miles from the fort, and Clark organized a party to go see it and obtain blubber and oil. Sacagawea insisted on going along. She argued that she had traveled a great distance to see the great water, and she was not going to be denied the opportunity to see this great fish. Clark agreed, and she accompanied the party to see the whale. This incident is significant because it shows Sacagawea asserting her own desires and agency. She was not merely a passive participant in the expedition but someone with her own motivations and will. The return journey began in March 1806. The expedition retraced much of their route, though they split into smaller parties at times to explore different areas. Sacagawea continued to serve as guide and interpreter. In July 1806, when Clark's party was exploring the Yellowstone River, Sacagawea suggested a route through what is now Bozeman Pass in Montana. Clark followed her advice, and it proved to be an excellent route. This demonstrated that her knowledge of the geography extended beyond just the immediate area where she had lived as a child. She had learned the land and could read the terrain. The expedition arrived back at the Mandan villages in August 1806. This is where Sacagawea's journey with the Corps of Discovery ended. Charbonneau was paid $500.33 for his services. Sacagawea received nothing officially, though William Clark later wrote that she deserved far more credit than her husband. Clark had become deeply attached to young Jean-Baptiste, whom he called "my little dancing boy." He offered to adopt the child and raise him in St. Louis, providing him with an education. Sacagawea and Charbonneau initially declined, but they agreed that when the boy was older, they would bring him to Clark. The historical record becomes less clear after Sacagawea left the expedition. What happened to her in the years following 1806 is a matter of some debate and controversy among historians. One account suggests that Sacagawea and Charbonneau traveled to St. Louis around 1809, where Clark helped them and took responsibility for Jean-Baptiste's education. A document from 1811 indicates that Charbonneau purchased land in Missouri, though he soon sold it and returned to the upper Missouri region, suggesting he was not suited to settled farming life. Some historical records suggest that Sacagawea gave birth to a daughter named Lizette around 1812. The most widely accepted historical account, based on documentation from Fort Manuel in present-day South Dakota, indicates that Sacagawea died on December 20, 1812. She was approximately 24 or 25 years old. A clerk at the fort, John Luttig, recorded in his journal that the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of putrid fever, likely typhoid or diphtheria. This account is considered reliable by most historians because Luttig had no reason to fabricate the entry and was recording routine events at the fort. If this account is accurate, Sacagawea's life was tragically short. She survived an incredible journey across the continent and back, only to die of illness a few years later at a remote trading post. However, there is an alternative account that persists, particularly in oral traditions. Some sources claim that Sacagawea left Charbonneau, lived for many more years, and eventually joined the Comanche tribe before returning to the Wind River Shoshone Reservation in Wyoming. According to this account, she lived until 1884, dying as an old woman named Porivo on the reservation. This woman was buried at Wind River, and her grave is marked as Sacagawea's. However, most academic historians find this account less credible because it conflicts with contemporary documentary evidence and because the woman at Wind River may have been a different Shoshone woman entirely. The debate continues, but the 1812 death date is generally accepted by scholars. Regardless of when she died, Sacagawea's contributions to the Lewis and Clark expedition were immense. Her presence as a woman with a baby signaled to Native American tribes that the expedition was not a war party, which likely prevented violent confrontations. Her knowledge of edible plants provided crucial nutrition. Her geographic knowledge helped guide the expedition through difficult terrain. Her translation skills enabled critical negotiations with the Shoshone that provided the horses necessary to cross the mountains. Without those horses, the expedition would have failed. Her calm competence in crisis situations, like when she saved supplies from the pirogue, demonstrated her value repeatedly. William Clark acknowledged in his journals that she was indispensable to the expedition's success. Beyond her practical contributions, Sacagawea's story resonates because of what she represents. She was a young indigenous woman who endured capture, displacement, and hardship, yet she showed remarkable courage and resilience. She adapted to circumstances beyond her control while maintaining her dignity and capability. She participated in one of the most famous expeditions in American history, traveling thousands of miles through wilderness while caring for an infant. She navigated between cultures, serving as a bridge between Native American peoples and American explorers. Her story is one of survival, strength, and quiet heroism. Sacagawea's legacy grew significantly in the 20th century. She was largely forgotten for decades after her death, mentioned only briefly in histories of the expedition. But as interest in women's history and Native American history grew, Sacagawea emerged as an important figure. In 1905, suffragettes adopted her as a symbol of women's competence and worth, pointing to her contributions to argue that women deserved the right to vote. Statues and monuments were erected in her honor across the country. More monuments have been dedicated to Sacagawea than to any other American woman. In 2000, the United States Mint issued a dollar coin bearing her image, making her one of the few women and the only Native American woman to appear on U.S. currency. The memorialization of Sacagawea has not been without controversy. Some critics argue that she has been romanticized and turned into a symbol that serves American mythology rather than historical accuracy. They point out that she was essentially enslaved, first by the Hidatsa and then through her marriage to Charbonneau, and that she had little choice in participating in the expedition. They argue that celebrating her role in an expedition that ultimately facilitated westward expansion and the displacement of native peoples is problematic. These are valid concerns that complicate her legacy. Sacagawea's story is not simply one of heroic adventure but also one of colonization, cultural collision, and the experiences of indigenous women in a time of dramatic change. Nevertheless, Sacagawea remains an important historical figure who deserves recognition. She was a real person who lived through extraordinary circumstances and made genuine contributions to a significant historical event. Her intelligence, resourcefulness, and endurance are undeniable. She navigated multiple worlds and cultures with skill. She protected and cared for her child through incredibly difficult conditions. She maintained her composure and effectiveness when others, including her husband, failed. These qualities merit admiration regardless of the broader historical context. Sacagawea was not a perfect symbol or a simple hero, but she was a remarkable woman whose story continues to fascinate and inspire more than 200 years after her journey across the continent. Her life, though short, left an indelible mark on American history and continues to be studied, debated, and remembered today.